This is a No Fear podcast. We know what scares you. I'm Mel,
And I'm Lisa.
and this is a No Fear cast, the podcast where we dissect horror and all the things that scare us. This is season 4, episode 14, and we are joined by Andy Davidson, author of In the Valley of the Sun, and he is here to talk with us today about his latest novel, The Boatman's Daughter. And I'll now pass it on to you, Lisa, to tell us a little bit about The Boatman's Daughter before we get into our discussion.
All right, so here are just some things to describe The Boatman's Daughter. Apparently, Paul Tremblay called it a lush nightmare, and it's been compared to the heady myth-making of Neil Gaiman and the heart-rending pacing of Joe Hill. So I'm just going to read the little summary here, just so everybody knows what this book is about, and I can't wait to talk to Andy to find out a little bit more about this. Ever since her father was killed when she was just a child, Miranda Crabtree has kept her head down and her eyes up, ferrying contraband for a mad preacher and his declining band of followers to make ends meet and to protect an old witch and a secret child from harm. But dark forces are at work in the bayou, both human and supernatural, conspiring to disrupt the rhythms of Miranda's peculiar and precarious life. And when the preacher makes an unthinkable demand, it sets Miranda on a desperate, dangerous path, forcing her to consider what she is willing to sacrifice to keep her loved ones safe. All right. So, hi, Andy.
Hey.
Thanks for coming on the podcast again.
Thanks for asking me back.
All right. Well, I'll just dive into this book because I'm really curious. So your last book was set in Texas, and you've moved this one to Arkansas. I know you're from Arkansas, but I was wondering why you chose this kind of backwoods river setting for this book.
Well, I knew in the second book, which was kind of being written concurrently when I was trying to sell the first book. So this book's actually been in existence in some form since probably 2015. And I knew that I wanted to write in the second book about home, about my home. And I wanted it to be a more personal experience than the first novel was. And because I was writing this book before I had actually sold the first book, I figured, well, you better go ahead and do that now, because you may not get a shot to do it later. Like if the first book doesn't sell, you're going to be just bereft and you won't have the energy down the line to write another book, and you'll probably have failed miserably at this. Fortunately, that did not happen. But so I wrote this book kind of with that in mind, that this might be my last chance to have the energy to write another novel, which I don't think it is, obviously, fortunately now. But the Arkansas setting is in part based on where I grew up. I'm about an hour from the southwest corner of Arkansas. And there's a town there called Fouke, which has a sort of storied history in for a couple of reasons. The foremost of those is that back in the 1960s, Fouke was subject to a lot of sightings of a supposed monster. It became known as the Fouke monster. And then I think in the 1970s, 1972 72, a filmmaker named Charles Pierce, who was from Arkansas, made a pseudo documentary called The Legend of Boggy Creek, which I don't know if you guys know that movie, but it kind of has the blush of legitimacy to it because it has a narrator. It's made up of documentary footage. It seems like it actually uses the local people of the town to tell the story of this town that's supposedly being terrorized by a monster in the woods. And the town of Fouke is located along a river. It's kind of a swampy bottomland area. And I saw that movie when I was 12 years old. And I was staying at the Holodome in Monroe, Louisiana. and I was sitting up late at night watching TBS Superstation, and it came on, and it scared the bejesus out of me because it was set so close to where I lived. I had never seen a film before that seemed A, so real, and B, um, struck so close to home. So Falk was always this kind of interesting place to me that I always in the back of my mind thought, well, I'm going to write about that one day. And one of the other pieces that came from that is that Falk was known later in the, I guess I would say like 2007, 2008, somewhere in there, for a cult leader who was arrested by the FBI for doing horrible, nefarious things. And this guy turned out to be quite a figure when I started researching him. And so he sort of fed into that idea too. But yeah, Arkansas. Why Arkansas? It's home. It's and I figure, like one of the things I do is I write in southern settings, and I can't imagine right now like moving out of the South. Even when you move west, you're still kind of in the South with Texas. But yeah, I think uh, most writers at some point end up writing about where they're from. So I figured best get on it.
I'm not familiar with the movie that you mentioned, but there was a second one, right?
Oh yeah. The
I've
Legend of
seen that
Boggy
one.
Creek 2 or Return to Boggy Creek or something like that. Is a terrible
Mhm.
movie.
It's
Um,
awful. Yeah,
I think Mystery Science Theater even did a spoof on it.
they did.
That,
Yeah.
that's how I know it. Yeah, it's wretched, but yeah, no, the first one is actually that film is actually a really good movie. All things considered, I mean, it's not it's not great art or anything, but it definitely is frightening. It definitely has atmosphere. It definitely seems to be a portrait of the place and the people, while weirdly at the same time exploiting them for this kind of cheap drive-in B movie plot, So it's kind of a neat thing.
Since this book was a little bit closer to home for you, was the writing process different? I mean, even though you're working on both at the same time, did you kind of approach this novel differently?
Um, maybe there was a little more research, I guess, into place just a little bit more. I think every novel is a little different for me. Like I'm working on a third book now that's very different in the way I'm approaching it. And so in this case, I think I went through several drafts before I had something that I felt like was the right version of the story. But I knew from the very beginning, one of the major differences with this book is I knew from the very beginning that I loved the characters and I loved the world. And I felt that all the way through it. I think within the Valley of the Sun, there were some times when I kind of struggled to connect with the material in the early stages of writing it. And I had to do some changes and kind of inject some supernatural elements more into that book to kind of really bring it to life for me. But for the Boatman's Daughter, pretty much from the beginning, I was excited about it. So that's one major difference. I felt like this was something that even if nobody else liked it or thought it was interesting, it certainly appealed to me, and I would want to read this book.
I don't want to jump too much into the kind of supernatural, but I'm going to because I don't know. As you were describing, talking about the book itself, two things, and I think this is what made me want to read this book. So, I mean, this was one of my most anticipated books. So I was so excited to actually get it in my hands. But the two things are kind of local supernatural folklore. I love that. That is, I mean, it's the first thing I want to know when I go to a new place
Mhm.
is, is there sort of local witch or monster or whatever. I've always just been fascinated about that. And I think it can tell you so much about a place itself. But then when you mentioned that there was actually a cult leader that you were researching, that just lights up a whole different part of my reading brain because I love both of those things.
Right.
Um, but when you were building out the supernatural kind of part of it, because it's not just that kind of boggy creek
Hmm.
river monster thing. There's a lot throughout the book that is drawn from different places. Like, I recognized a lot of, and we've talked about it on the podcast before, but like the character of Baba Yaga, like a Russian type witch character,
Right.
even down to the house on, not quite on chicken legs, but it was almost chicken chicken legs.
She has chickens
Um,
under the porch.
right.
Yeah.
um, so what other kinds of like folklore and supernatural research did you like kind of pour into the pot of this book? Because I bet there's a lot that I even missed.
Well, there was a very big, thick book that I read several times, which was a new experience for me. Back to like Mel's question about what was different. Research for me has always been a process of kind of Googling something and checking maps and in this particular case, I knew that if I was going to write about a witch, which was kind of one of the starting points for the second book, I thought, okay, in the first book you wrote about a vampire or vampires. um, what is a way to kind of what could be another character that you would want to write about? And obviously there's a lot of like famous Hollywood type monsters like vampires, werewolves, mummies, things like that. But I was thinking more like witches. Witches are interesting. And so when I decided on a witch, I kind of thought, well, it can't be um, Harry Potter magic. It can't be even Lord of the Rings magic. It can't be um, flashing and colorful things firing out of wands and people having duels and fights and things like that. That seems silly to me, because everything I do, I try to ground it in reality. And in this case, I wanted to dig into the myths behind witches, and I started obviously with the Baba Yaga because that's one of the sort of older myths and really more interesting myths too. And I had read a book by a guy named Toby Barlow, who that book was actually published by FSG. It was called Baba Yaga. And I don't know if you guys are familiar with it, but I don't know that it was actually hugely successful, but I just happened to have it years ago and had not read it. And it's a book about witches in Paris in the 1960s. So it kind of blends all of these different sensibilities, from the Baba Yaga myth to kind of Jean-Luc Godard sensibility about uh, nightlife in Paris. And there's a crime element to it. There's a man that's transformed into a flea, and the book is full of these interludes that are basically songs, uh, poems composed in the kind of rhythm and speech of the witches that are almost like spells. And I thought that was really neat. Um, and so I wanted to kind of understand how all of that works in the myth. And so I read a gigantic book called The Bathhouse at Midnight. Um, and it's kind of a history of magic and divination in Russia. And there's a lot in that book that I pulled from as inspiration for the things that happen in the story in the novel. So that was the Baba Yaga part of it. Um, and I think in terms of the monster element, talking about the Boggy Creek thing, I didn't want a monster terrorizing the town like that. That's done to death, and we all kind of chuckle at the Bigfoot societies that meet and have their little seminars and whatnot. And I didn't want anything like that. Like, I didn't want a Bigfoot type character. I didn't want a monster, but I wanted that strange sort of empathy that we have with monsters. And so I thought, well, one of the other source material pieces was The Tempest by William Shakespeare, right? So the monster in The Tempest, of course, is Caliban, who's the offspring of the witch. And these things kind of started connecting together for me. And there's a Hogarth painting that features Caliban off to the side, and he almost looks like a child, a deformed child with webbed feet and hands and scales. He's carrying a bundle of sticks. He looks like a beast of burden. And it's a very pitiable portrait of Caliban, who in the play is pitiable up to a point, but does some pretty awful things too. And so I thought, well, how can I, take that and do something with that? And so that became the character of Little Fish. So you've got the witch, you've got the sort of magical fish boy, and the setting, of course, being that part of Arkansas that's kind of wild and untamed, and then there was the character of Miranda in The Tempest, um, who I think in The Tempest, Miranda is an interesting character in that she doesn't have a lot of agency. She's pretty much pushed back and forth kind of in the schemes of her father, Prospero. And so, of course, the Prosper River in The Boatman's Daughter is drawn from Prospero, almost as if Miranda in The Boatman's Daughter is a child of the river, that the river is her parent. And it, in The Boatman's Daughter, does kind of bind her into the place in terms of being her livelihood as she transports drugs up and down the river and is part of the schemes of the preacher and all of that. So there was a lot of thought that went into this at the front about how these pieces all fit together, and a lot of reading that was done. So yeah, I mean, I think that kind of answers the question. It's kind of a long answer, but there was a lot.
That does answer a lot of it. No, I love the Shakespeare Tempest because I don't know. I think it's hard to make allusions or even kind of build a story around something like Shakespeare without it feeling done before. But this does, I mean, this feels like something completely new, which I really enjoyed because it was you could see the starts of some of, like you said, the starts of some of these characters, but they became something new in the story, and I really enjoyed that.
Yeah, yeah. The one of the things I talked about with my editor early on was she and I kind of had a conversation about how much we wanted to market the book as an adaptation or a retelling or whatever of The Tempest. And I was pretty adamant that it wasn't, that The Tempest was kind of just a leaping off point, that it was, um, you know, maybe a remix might be a way to put it, but I think ultimately FSG's just sort of kind of tossed that aside and was like, we're not going to talk about Shakespeare. Because at the time there was this thought that people like retellings of Shakespeare, and it's like, well, okay. But like you said, it has been done before, and I think around the time, one of the things that, there's always that moment as a writer where you have a giant crisis where you think, oh my God, what's going on here? I had this great idea, and now this other book has come out, and I think it was Margaret Atwood's Hagseed had come out. And so I picked that up in the bookstore, and I'm right in the middle of, drafting probably version 8 of my novel. And I read, retelling of The Tempest, and it's like, oh, come on. No. Margaret Atwood. But
Like,
no.
if it was anybody else, I might be
Right.
able.
Right. Well, as it turns out, Margaret Atwood did not get in the way. So
Okay, I know Mel probably has a question or two, and I promise I'm going to let her talk at some point. But so you mentioned Hogarth,
mhm.
and that is, I will just say, is one of the areas that I'm super nerdy about is Hogarth, especially his engravings.
Mhm.
And he has that whole series on, and I'm sure it's on cruelty and there's another word and my brain is blanking. The stages of cruelty,
Mhm.
where he goes through, that's still not it. I cannot land on the title of it, but you know what I'm talking about. where it has a person graduating basically from like torturing animals all the way to killing women to being killed as a criminal and then finally lying on the dissection table.
Yes.
And yeah, and I don't know why I can't pull the name of it out of my out of my brain right now. But I always think with that, I love that series of engravings because it talks about as humans can be to each other and just the depth that one person can do to, and I think that's one thing that really fleshes out your books really well because you balance the supernatural element with a kind of real true human monster.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, that was not really a question, but where did you, I guess I'll say, where did you draw that part of it?
Balancing the two things, or?
Yeah.
Well, for me, I think there's always the necessity when you're writing horror. And I guess it would be the case if I were writing anything, if it were science fiction, if it were fantasy, if it were, a crime novel. I think it would always be rooted in characters, and characters have to feel real. They have to be real. And so the balancing act of making real characters and putting them into extraordinary situations with magic and gods and things like that can be tricky. I think it's in this book. I think a lot of it works because of setting. That's kind of like an anchor. The place, the natural world. Going back to that idea of the witch and the Baba Yaga flying around in a mortar and a pestle and all of that. I mean, there were certain things obviously that I was not going to do. The Baba Yaga's house was not going to stand up and walk on chicken legs, because I think, for one thing, that would be too specifically rooted in the Baba Yaga myth to do that, because this isn't taking place in Russia. This isn't a Russian fairy tale. This is a kind of Arkansas swamp fairy tale. And so it has to be the Arkansas swamp version of that, which is basically just a house kind of set up on stilts that has chickens under it, I mean, and anytime something magical happens, it has to happen through the natural world. It has to come out of a physical object or something. And so for me, I think that was that, and having really strong, well-developed characters was the way you kind of balance those two things. In I think that was your question, but you were also asking about like the horrific too, right?
Yeah, this is the danger night, is that my brain at some point just stopped. But
maybe we should let Mel
that
ask
was
the
part
questions.
we'll let her ask the next question. Yeah,
Ask
it
me
was
some
partly
clear,
that.
cogent questions, Mel.
I'm working on it. I'm trying to come up with one.
Just to be clear, I did not dictate the time for this. This was dictated to me. It's
I
almost 10 o'clock
know.
here Eastern time, so I'm drinking coffee.
That's good thing. Yeah, no, that was part of my question. The other part, I think, was because you had mentioned at the very beginning that it almost as a side note, leader in
Yes.
this small town.
Right.
And clearly there's human monsters, if you want to call them that, in your book as well.
Yes.
How much did you do into that? Because I would think it would be easier just to be like, okay, and figure out what I can take than it would be to think, okay, a human being fully evil. Where did you look for that?
Well, when I was doing the research into the cult figure, I always hesitate to say his name because, like, I think he's dead. I think he died in prison. But I hate to throw his name out there because, I don't want to give him any credit for anything. He's just a really awful person. But there there was a theatricality to him, as I guess there is to all cult leaders, that was instantly kind of appealing in terms of storytelling. You could see the amazing character that this would make in fiction. Because in real life, nobody is that strange, it seems. And yet here you have this character who is in fact that strange. And so there were some images of him. He basically had a career way early on in Nashville as a fashion designer. And you can actually find pictures of Dolly Parton and Kenny Rogers, people like that, wearing his rhinestone studded jackets that were his signature item, I think. But that transferred into a kind of religious career when he met his wife. And they had a ministry that they built together that, I guess through their connections with Nashville, enabled them to get on to like the Grand Ole Opry and really have a kind of really have access to a large audience. In which case, some cult leaders probably wouldn't. So for a time, they just seemed to be these perfectly weird religious people. We all remember Tammy Faye and was it Jim Baker? We remember the kind of outlandish, weird TV evangelists from the 80s or the 70s, and we don't really think of them as cult leaders per se. So for a time, it seemed like there was that aspect to their ministry. But there were also some images that I found online when I was looking at video of their old performances where he would sing and she would preach or whatever, of him standing behind her with his hands on her shoulders. And she has this very kind of gothic, it's a very gothic sort of image of she's got her eyes closed in prayer and he's behind her holding her shoulders. And she's wearing this long red shawl and has this white blonde kind of platinum hair. So really just interesting stuff. But in terms of like balancing out that outlandishness with what later I think became a much more awful intent behind his cult, I wanted to depict the aftermath of that kind of thing. I didn't want to deal with a cult in its prime. I wanted to deal with a cult in decline. And I think in my book, the character of Billy Cotton is in part based on this real figure that I looked at and did research into. But he's also largely invention in that things have not gone well for him. And that was sort of my point of entry of I guess empathy for the character too, is we have to have that. As monstrous as characters are, you have to have a point at which you can feel for characters. And in Billy Cotton's case, I wanted him to be a man kind of trying in his own insane, mad way to atone for his past, to set things right. But of course, for him, in his skewed and warped way, setting things right means doing even more horrible things. In terms of the other characters, apart from the cult leader, apart from the Billy Cotton character, there wasn't a lot of research that I did, actually. Most of it was based around things the characters did. Like Miranda is an archer. So I looked into archery. I bought a book on archery called The Archer's Bible by Fred Bear, which was written in 1960 and contained lots of delightfully horrible sexist images of women in shorts and high heels firing archery. arrows into targets. But it also had lots of good information about archery, about arrows, about types of stances, about all these things that I didn't know because nobody in my family hunts immediately in my family. So I'm not a hunter. So I had to learn about things like that. But in terms of beyond that, no, I mostly just things about boats and bows and arrows.
Well, I have a question that might be a little kind of on the nose or a little bit more specific, but there's this one scene, and I'm only about like halfway through the book. I'm really enjoying it so far, but I wasn't able to finish it before talking to you tonight. But there's a scene where Miranda goes to see Little Fish, and she gives him some comic books to read, and he is obsessed with reading these comic books. So we find out that he keeps a book with him at all times that he can read in his tree. And it just seemed like such a real detail. I mean, you have this little kid who has fish-like characteristics, and yet he's just like any other kid. And I
Hmm.
thought of this when you were talking about the idea of mixing realism and the supernatural, because it's got to be real or else the person isn't going to go with it. I was wondering how much influence maybe specific comics might have had on either the book in general or maybe on that particular character. And I know you don't want to do spoilers for people who are listening, so I hope that's not too specific.
No, that's great. I like talking about this. This is well, obviously, Swamp Thing is a big connection to the material. Um, the the passage that you're talking about, I think there's a later in the book. There's a passage at least where um, Little Fish shows the comic to a new friend that he makes, and the cover is described of one of his comic books, and it's actually a cover of a Swamp Thing from the early 1970s, when Bernie Wrightson and Lynn Wein were still on the comic before Alan Moore got involved with it. And it's kind of a classic pose of Swamp Thing being attacked by a mob, and there's he's rearing up, and then the mob is being deflected, and they've got pitchforks and torches and things like that. So I think for him, one of the things that he sees in that character in particular is some version of his own story, right? The idea of someone who is of the earth somehow, has this affinity for plants and gardening and nature, and but I think also he doesn't think too much about that because he's never really met another child, so he doesn't have that self-consciousness that adults would about how he might look too different from someone else.
Mhm.
So in some ways it's more about just kids like comic books, and so that is kind of part of it, is normalizing him in that way, like making him um just a boy.
No, that's really interesting. And I really like that touch. And yeah, that's kind of cool, like having him identify with someone like Swamp Thing. Because, yeah, I think, you know, that's a very human reaction to approach something like that with, unfortunately, pitchforks and flames and have that kind of mob mentality. Do you, thinking about that, it made me think about something you said earlier about the natural world in relation to the human in the book. Do you feel like the way the natural world works in this book, with the importance of the river and the witch and little fish and these sorts of things that you've been talking about, does the natural world kind of mimic the extremes in behavior, do you think, that the people are experiencing in this setting, or vice versa? Are they matched? Because it seems like there's extreme kind of behavior and reactions on the human's part that make them monstrous but also sympathetic. And then there's also kind of these extremes that they're having to try to survive just in the natural world. And I was wondering, how do you see them kind of playing off of each other, or are they embedded in each other?
That's a really good question. I don't think that they have a direct there's not like a cause and effect necessarily, where uh, I don't know, that's Well, I think about like, yeah, there's a lot of early in the book, in the first section, there's a storm, and then at the end of the book, there's another storm, and so the natural world kind of bookends things with being very violent, and certainly there's that same violent potential within someone like Billy Cotton who lives on the river. Um, I think they're at odds with each other in a lot of ways, but they may possess some of the same. Um, I don't know if I would say madness necessarily, but the 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 natural world in this is not entirely benevolent, and in the same way that I think Billy Cotton is not 100% evil per se. Um, but I don't think that the natural world is as it is in something like Swamp Thing, where you have a very clear delineation between there's the natural world, which is the good, the green, and the human world, which is destroying that world. In this particular case, in this book, I think it's more like humanity is intruding upon that world in a kind of territorial way. Like there can only be one God in the forest, so to speak, and that God is not Billy Cotton.
Okay, yeah, interesting. I could see that. Yeah, they seem to me to be kind of like working in tandem in some way. But yeah, I see what you're saying about like nature kind of maybe holding the people in place or being like the kind of opposing force. That's
There,
interesting. Yeah.
there's a passage too. It makes me think of where you have the bottom dwellers, the kind of river people who are kind of on the periphery of all of this, but um, in the opening section when that storm comes, they're kind of looking out at it, and I think one of the things that's in there is something about their own. They see in the mud washing away, they kind of see their own slow annihilation. So I definitely, yes, there is that connection between the two things, like and that's part of it, right? Like growing up on the river, you are bound to the river. The river is your livelihood. The river is your life. It was Miranda's father's life, and now it's hers. um, and I think maybe, hopefully, I don't know, there's some peace made with that in the book, maybe by the end. I don't know.
Yeah, it's kind of when you were saying that kind of reminded me of, like Zora Neale Hurston's Her Eyes Are Watching God when the
Yeah.
hurricane is happening and they just basically are like, okay, this is where we are, and we're just gonna try to survive it. Like it's not like it's evil or the hurricane is a horrible thing. It's an act of nature and they just have to sit and try to survive it.
Right. There's a similar thing in, I just recently read Salvage the Bones, right? And
Hmm.
there's that same sort of thing with Katrina, that hits the community there. This thing comes and we just have to weather it. Yeah.
Yeah. Another thing that I found interesting reading this so far and seeing some of the blurbs about the book is, I think when we look at this, people are thinking Southern Gothic, whatever that is. That's something that gets debated a whole lot, and I don't
A
want to talk
wide
about that
net.
for like 2 hours, but and then we have like Grit South or Gritty South or whatever. I mean, the South just keeps on going through all these different permutations of horror.
Yeah.
Um, do you I'm not you are doing something completely different from a lot of Southern Gothic, so I'm not saying like tell me how you're like so and so, but I was just wondering if there are some Southern Gothic writers either from like ye old ones from a while back or somebody working now where you're just like, oh, that's kind of cool, and like maybe that was like you see maybe a tendril of not necessarily influence but just like kind of like being in that same place or some parallels.
Maybe I thought a lot about Flannery O'Connor when I was writing this. I thought a lot about her preacher characters, like Hazel Motes, and there's the character in The Violent Buried Away. Um, but I don't know. I mean, one doesn't say, yes, I'm like Flannery O'Connor,
Right.
but I definitely would say she was on my mind. Um, um, Faulkner is always there too. Like, these are the people that both serve as inspiration, and they also haunt you if you're from the South. Um, uh, I'm not. I guess, yeah, obviously. Davis Grubb, The Night of the Hunter. That book probably will be something that influences almost every book I ever read. Because I think, for on one end of that, I think is this is my favorite book. I've never read a book that I responded to with so much love and uh, just flat out devotion, and I will proselytize for it, as Night of the Hunter, and the film as well, of course. But the book is amazing, and the language is lyrical, um, in just the right ways. And it's, of course, about a river journey. It's about children on the river. It's about, a preacher who is, himself corrupted, is a horrible human being, and hides behind religion, cloaks himself in religion. Um, so I think that, more than anything else, like, that vein of the Southern Gothic, maybe with faith and religion, played into it much more than anything else. Yeah.
Well, that's interesting. Yeah, I can totally see that. I could totally see like Hazel Motes being uh somehow like a cousin or something, maybe to Billy Cotton in a way.
Well, because that's,
Or far
yeah,
away.
Hazel is the Church of, is it the Church of Christ without Christ? Isn't that
Hmm.
Hazel? And so
Yep.
Billy Cotton has essentially become that. He's, whatever the church is, it's not about Christ. It's not about mercy. It's almost the church of his wife at this point. He's almost worshiping his dead wife. Yeah.
So, Andy, we've really enjoyed this conversation with you, and I'm so looking forward to finishing this book. I know we could probably keep talking, but if we do, we might risk spoiling it for listeners who haven't finished yet or still need to run out and get their copy. So, with that said, I want to give you a little bit of time to tell our listeners about how to contact you or follow you on social media, if you'd like to share a website or something. And then also, I believe this is going to be coming out during the second leg of your book tour. So, if you would like to tell our listeners about that as well, that would be awesome.
Sure. My website is theandydavidson.com, and I have a contact form there that you can get me by email with. I'm also on Twitter at the Andy Davidson. I'm on Instagram, same handle. I'm on Facebook. I've got a public profile. You can find me there. Um, the book tour is on March 3rd. I'm going to be at Novel in Memphis, Tennessee. And then the day after that, I'm in Jackson, Mississippi on the 4th at Lemuria Books. And let's see, Friday, March 6th, I'll be at Garden District Books in New Orleans. And on March 7th, I'm in Port Neches, Texas at Fleur-Fine Books. And I think the very last stop on the tour is March 10th in Russellville, Arkansas at Dog Ear Books. So if you're in any of those places on any of those dates and you don't have anything better to do, why not come buy a book and see me?
Yes, listeners, we highly recommend checking out this book. And yeah, if you are near any of those places on any of those dates, please do go and say hey to Andy. I'm sure he'd appreciate it.
Very
All
much.
right. So, with that said, we at the No Fear Cast would love to hear from you. We are at No Fear Cast on Twitter and Instagram, and we have a Facebook page. If you'd like to contact us by email, and we do like getting emails, please send us an email at nofearcast@gmail.com. And if you love what we're doing, please consider supporting us on Patreon, where you can get access to exclusive content available on our off weeks between main episodes. Or you can simply rate and review us, which is entirely free and helps other listeners find us. Thank you so much for listening. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and we will be back in 2 weeks with a brand new one.